in time and space, particularly the way that marriage in Africa involves the transfer of bride wealth and all the complexities that these kinds of transactions lead to. The notion of double descent, as we were talking about the other day, etc. There is, however, one single article in the entire book that has to do with a cognatic society. Everything else has to do with humanal societies. And the cognatic society person sort of is apologetic that she can't find the descent group in this particular situation, and accounts for the existence of the cognatic society largely on ecological, political, and ideological terms. This particular society inhabits a floodplain, much more severely so than in the case of the Newark. In other words, cultivatable land at a premium is a good deal of population pressure. And the argument is that in a cognatic society, one has the freedom to activate kinship ties with either parent of either spouse, so that the cognatic system acts as a way of ensuring the most efficient distribution of the population amidst the scarce land. You follow that? Okay? That is to say, a couple will know that they have the right to cultivate land around the mound of the groom's father, the groom's mother, the bride's mother, the bride's father. Furthermore, that should land become available elsewhere, one can always move. So the picture one has of a cognatic society in terms of descent and residence is one of sort of built-in fluidity and instability. The point is also made that divorce rates in this society are quite high. And one of the features of these early works on African kinship and marriage is in fact a systematic study of divorce rates, which, as you might expect, are much, much higher in matrilineal societies than in patrilineal. But in at least this particular book, highest of all in cognatic societies. Right? The intriguing dimension with this, of course, is that there's practically no bride price involved in this cognatic society. And furthermore, the choice of which parent the child goes with is largely optative. That is to say, the pattern is generally that boys stay with their father and girls stay with their mother. And again, where people go to live on divorce, again, is quite variable. So trying to get a nice, neat organizational pattern out of a cognatic society drives people bananas. Okay? Now, in subsequent years, it develops that one of the few generalizations we can make about the relationship of descent to ecological patterns comes precisely out of this study. That island societies are prototypically cognatic. Thus, Polynesian societies, if they have clans at all, the clans are apt to be ceremonial, ritual, usually not exogenous. And ergo, the argument is made that when there is any kind of population pressure, the tendency to lineality is going to go down the tubes. And in recent years, the study of changing economic, political, ideological, etc., systems in Africa indicate that the general tendency as private, to a degree, vindicating the views of Marx and Engels and Morgan, that when private property gets to be significant, particularly when participation in the cash economy gets to be significant, the patronage usually begins to crumble. Oddly enough, the matronage in Africa has remained powerful and even apparently growing in power, which presents us with a number of interesting problems. The reference I can best give you comes from a book edited by Douglas and Cabery called Man in Africa that came out about 20 years ago. And Douglas's splendid little article is Matrilineal Union. She spells all the reasons why masculinity is not doomed in Africa, reversing some of our prior assumptions about the inherent fragility of matrilineal societies. They turn out to be, in some respects, far more adaptable to changing economic conditions than our patrilineal societies. Right? Okay, that raises a host of issues that we didn't get into. I just wanted to cover these important points, especially about cognatic societies. Because, as it turns out, one of the curious consequences of having so much of the early fieldwork in social anthropology done in Africa led to a certain theoretical overstress on the importance of the unilinear descent group. This becomes, the model of how these societies are chugging away. For the American anthropologists, particularly in the 30s, led by Redfield, okay, as anthropologists begin to trickle down into Mexico and Latin America and start working with peasant societies, a whole new host of theoretical problems in marriage and the family, the allocation of scarce resources through generation and across space gets to be an entirely different kind of matter. Right? And this becomes even more complicated when the first generation of British social anthropologists finally get to India, where you find the unilineal descent group flourishing, right, in the midst of what looks to be like a very peasant economy. So all of a sudden, the theoretical complexities here just multiply. How is it that Latin American peasants have nothing but cognatic systems, and very strong cognatic systems indeed, whereas rather similar political economic systems in India seem to not only sustain but even encourage the growth of corporate lending systems, which kind of proliferate all over the lot. They're not going away in India either. Right? But for a period in the 60s and 70s, there was intense interest in the problems of peasant societies and efforts to try to generalize the phenomena, thinking that we can now begin to work on European materials. We can find peasants in Asia. Let's compare feudal systems in Asia and Europe and how these things are all working and the importance of cognatic systems in this sense. In the fullness of time, it became apparent that we were looking at apples and stones, and efforts to make systematic generalizations about the cognatic social organization of peasants just simply have gone nowhere. Okay? But anyway, I call that to your attention because peasant studies is still wide open and particularly intractable or difficult for the anthropologists. All right? Okay. The reasons for that, that's a mysterious pronouncement indeed. Reasons for that is that peasant societies are always party societies. Okay? The peasants always stand in relation to some larger socio-political economic entity, characteristically the city, the palace, the monastery, what have you. Right? And the kinds of relations that draw the peasant into the wider market economy, political system, ideological system, tend to be very variable and almost impossible to generalize from. Even in Latin America, you can't really say much of interest about Latin American peasantry. It varies region by region, almost one is tempted to say year by year. Okay? Getting patterns out of that is extraordinarily challenging. However, I would observe that some of the most interesting work on Latin American peasantry has been in the domain of so-called ritual kinship, i.e. doctrine, and how this is operating as a kind of all-purpose, all-function rubber band. Okay? But there again, it all depends. In certain Latin American societies, Cultural was an extraordinarily important mode of mediating between the social classes. Right? And in that, we begin to find what are called vertical factions developing. Right? Vertical factions refer to the fact that folks in power are visibly competing with one another. And the way that they compete is essentially by recruiting the next folks on the economic status ladder, who they sponsor and who become their clients. Those guys, in turn, drop down to the next level, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So from an important local landlord, you will have these ties of ritual kinship ramifying all the way right down to the most humble, penniless, landless peasant. Right? And these factions oppose one another in a particularly brutal, or often particularly brutal and divisive, pointless kind of way. Anyway, the contrast with corporate villainy of the sync groups, in other words, could not be greater. Okay, let's turn to the topic for today, witchcraft, oracles, and magic among the Azandi. In my copy of the book, it has a marvelous frontispiece. It has a bat, the word Mongo underneath, a chicken with the word Soroka, and a plant with the word Nagua, referring, in fact, to witchcraft, oracles, and magic. Respectively, a very nice kind of mantra. Okay, an extraordinary book. It remains among the most important ethnographies of all time. Published in 19... rats. No, the original date of publication. I'm pretty sure it's 1937. In other words, very, very early on. EP did his first field work with the Azandi. I'll tell you where they are. Okay, the Azandi homeland lies across the frontiers of three modern African states, the Republic of the Sudan, Zaire, and the République Centrafricaine, or whatever the hell that is now. The Azandi live in sparsely wooded savanna country, a vast plain crossed by innumerable small tree-fringed streams. What is particularly intriguing about the Azandi is that they have a quasi-feudal society. They have a kingly clan who usually present themselves as being strangers who have conquered the territory in this kingly clan known as the Abo